Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Bigfoot Tales. And excuse me. Today, we're going to take you to the northwest portion of this continent, and we're going to do a little article out of the Yukon World newspaper. And before we get too far, I just want to say that I've got a bit of a cold today. It's a nice, cold, rainy winter day today, so apologize if I sound a little off. But to get into the story, I believe most of us are well aware of the stories that come from Vancouver Island. Vancouver Island is essentially a added section of British Columbia. It's not actually what a lot of people consider to be an island. It's not remote. It's completely surrounded by water, but it is not inconceivable for something to very easily travel across from Vancouver Island onto the mainland British Columbia with no problem. It's just a wide river, but it's not as wide as some rivers are in the world. But at any rate, we'll get right into the article. This comes from the Yukon World newspaper. It's dated January 6, 1905. However, this story actually occurred a few days before that. It's titled Wild Man of the Woods. Missing link on Vancouver Island is the question in the subheading. And they state the story is not a fake. They also state that more than one has seen it, and a searching party is now out. It's actually comes out of the town of Nanaimo, or Nanaimo, and that's on Vancouver Island. It's dated December 26th with the byline of 1904. But they talk a little bit about the monkey people that have been seen on the island for ages. We go back into the history of various archaeological artifacts, and we find that especially in the Oregon area, we found small stone carvings of heads that look like more like monkey or gorilla heads rather than something that would be the norm for that area. So you have to wonder how many of these stories are actually fiction made out of the imagination of the people telling them. And how many of them are real. There's certainly enough evidence to suggest that there is something real going on in our backwoods. There's something floating around. We don't know what it is. We don't know whether it's an ape. We don't know whether it's a human, or whether it's some sort of brand new independent species all by itself. My opinion at this point in time is that it's probably more of a human than anything else, because of the intelligence that it seems to show. If it wasn't intelligent, I'm sure we wouldn't even be discussing it today. It'd be just another wild animal. But at any rate, let's go to Vancouver Island, and we'll read this article out of the Yukon World. Again, it's dated January 6, 1905. However, the actual story comes out of a town called Nanaimo, from British Columbia on the Vancouver Island, and it's dated December 21st of 1904. So this is another over 100-year-old story that we're sharing here on Bigfoot Tales. But let's get right into it. And this is, by the way, this is got some pretty interesting descriptions of this character or creature here that you really want to pay attention to. It may shed some light on some things, and it may not. But I find it very interesting that these stories with these descriptions are coming out of these areas long before any of the modern-day Bigfoot hoaxers have gotten into the act and tried to change the image of this creature that we've been searching for. But here's the article. The return of the searching party, which has gone to the vicinity of Campbell River to locate and capture the Mowgli youth, or wild man, who was seen there recently, is expected within the next few days. It is now the general belief that the Mowgli is a child lost from the Qualicum settlement about 12 years ago. The father of the missing youth accompanied the search party, which included the 4 Qualicum settlers, Messrs. A.B. Crump, J. Kincaid, T. Hutchins, and W. Buss, who came upon the wild man recently while out hunting. Evidence is piling up that the Campbell River is not an Indian myth or a farce. Scores of Indians are ready to testify that they have caught sight of the wild man during the last few years, but hitherto the reports have been generally scoffed at. Mike King has reiterated and further explained his original statement that he has seen the wild man several times. It was 3 or 4 years ago that Mike King came across the strange creature, which, according to his description, comes as near to the missing link as anyone could imagine. He was at the time making one of his solitary tramps prospecting the timber country inland from the head of Campbell River, his Indians having zealously refused to go beyond a certain landmark, which they referred to as the boundary of the man-monkey's country. It was drawing toward evening, and the man-beast was surprised in the act of bending over a little waterhole, washing certain edible grass roots, which he had disposed in 2 neat little piles. The one cleaned, the other awaiting cleaning. At the sound of Mr. King's approach, he uttered a very human cry of mingled terror and defiance, ran up the hillside halfway, and then stood curiously regarding the lonely intruder, who kept him covered with a gun. As soon as he had got his nerve together again, King made an effort to join the remarkable creature, which, at his approach, dashed through the underbrush exactly as a terrified deer would. He did not see him again, although his pathetic cries were heard at intervals during the night, and King, who sat the entire night outright with rifle in hand, was thoroughly convinced that the wild man slipped back silently to inspect him at distant range during the vigil. He says that the body was covered with reddish-brown hair, and that the arms were peculiarly long and used freely in climbing and brush running, while the trail showed a distinct human foot, but with phenomenally long and spreading toes. The Indians all through the northern Vancouver Island shun what they have since time immemorial set apart as the wild man's country, and no money or persuasive art will induce them to go into it with a hunter, trapper, timber cruiser, or prospector. King himself saw, in the unexplored country, shunned by all Indian tribes, a hut that seemingly had been built for shelter by some semi-human denizen of the woods. And that's the end of the article. There's just a few points here that I'd like to go over. And for those of you that haven't read it or listened to any of my stuff heretofore, I'm kind of what you'd consider a Bigfoot slash folklorist slash historian person, I guess you could call me. But I like researching the old newspapers for these old stories and articles. It's becoming more and more difficult to find ones that are any good, but the newspapers are hard to get. The years go by, they decay, and they're hard to search for. But we have ways to access some of these old stories. But there's a couple of items in this story here that we need to really look at. Now, one of them is the fact that the Indians called these creatures man-monkeys. They probably hadn't been calling on that for eternity, because for the most part in North America, monkeys hadn't really been known about until the early to mid-1800s. Gorillas and that sort of thing later in the later 1800s. So at some point in time, they started calling them man-monkeys instead of wild men. But as we go back through the thousands of years of history of this creature, we find that he's almost without exception referred to as a wild man, and not some kind of a man-beast. It's only when the white man started spreading the name of monkeys throughout the world and other races that it kind of caught on as being man-monkeys. They were men-monkeys or monkey men. A lot of different ways to say it, but it all amounts to the same thing. These creatures are referred to, or compared to rather, monkeys, when their descriptions are being given. It almost sounds like it might have been an orangutan, but of course orangutans are basically a Sumatran animal. They're not found anyplace else in the world except for that part of Indonesia. It's possible that one may have escaped from a ship or something that had been taken captive, but it's really hard to tell. I'm not really sure whether they would be able to tolerate the winters of British Columbia and Vancouver Island. Although in some ways the winters there are better than they are in other parts of the world, I guess. But it's neither here nor there for this point of the argument. But one paragraph in particular says that it was drawing toward evening, and the man-beast was surprised in the act of bending over a little waterhole, washing certain edible grass roots. Generally speaking, animals don't just simply get snuck up on. So it's pretty rare when we can actually come upon a situation like this, but we have heard stories through the years of Bigfoot being crept up upon and surprised in the act of doing things like this. Probably one of the more shared stories is the one where he was caught opening clams in a little river below a bridge that story's been changed a few times, but I'm not sure how many exact instances this has taken place, but I have a suspicion that some of the stories that you hear are actually repeats of something that had been heard before, even though the person telling the story wants you to believe that they actually came upon them. But we'll get into that another time. But we read that at the sound of Mr. King's approach, he uttered a very human cry of mingled terror and defiance. And we have heard stories also where this has been heard in the woods. They just can't. The sound is just too human from a lot of these cries that you've heard to be beyond any doubt of some sort of wild animal. He also states that he believes that the creature snuck back up on him during the night, and he believes that the wild man was inspecting him at a distance during his nightly vigil. But we also hear this happening. The description, Mr. King says that the body was covered with reddish-brown hair, and that the arms were peculiarly long and used freely in climbing, bush running, while the trail showed a distinct human foot, but with phenomenally long and spreading toes. And this we find in quite a few descriptions of contacts today. I think part of the problem that we have is some people claim that Bigfoot runs on all fours. I don't actually think he's running on all fours. I think if his arms are that long, he might be hunched over and possibly using in some way his hands to, bend the brush aside or something like that. But I don't think he actually runs on all fours like a dog does. So I think there's something there that we really need to take a harder look at as we're discussing these Bigfoot tales and incidents to determine exactly what this mythical creature that most of the country in the world says doesn't exist. Of course, if they didn't exist, where would the stories come from? And that's what I'm trying to get to at the bottom of this well that I'm digging here. But at any rate, don't want to keep you too long. This is just a quick one. And again, hope you enjoyed this Bigfoot tale. The Yukon Bigfoot incident or account that actually occurred on Vancouver Island. And we'll see you next time on Bigfoot Tales. Happy squatching, folks.